Hey, what's up, 8th graders? This is Miss Ludwig. We are starting a new unit on ecosystems. Your first set of notes, Intro to Ecosystems, is on page 3 in your lab notebook. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the structure of the biosphere. So first of all, what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem includes all of the living and the non-living things that interact with each other and the environment where they exist. So this picture here is an example of an ecosystem. Normally, at first sight, most people notice all of the living things in the picture. You see all of the different animals, the deer, the raccoon, the turtles, the fish. You may even also notice the plants. But in order for an ecosystem to exist, you also need non-living things. So the water, for example, is a non-living thing that most of these living things rely on every day. Most living things need the sun in order to survive. The sun is not alive, but it impacts all of the living things in the environment. Same as the air that these organisms are breathing. The air is not alive, but it is essential for life in the ecosystem. So several of the things we mentioned, living and non-living things. In 8th grade, where we love to use fancy words, we're going to use fancy words for living and non-living things in an ecosystem. So the living things are considered biotic factors. We know that our stem bio means life, so that's pretty easy to remember. And then all of the non-living things in an ecosystem are called abiotic factors, so without life. And both of these together is what creates an ecosystem. So the picture in the background here is another example of a different type of ecosystem. Most of the things in this picture are actually not alive, so they are abiotic factors. So some of our biotic factors would be the cacti and some of these shrubs around here. But then our non-living things, our abiotic factors, include the soil or the dirt that these living things are growing in, the rock, the air, the clouds in the background. So we need a mixture of these living, the biotic factors, and also the non-living or abiotic factors in order to make an ecosystem. In your notes, we have these two little boxes for biotic factors and abiotic factors. And on the next slide, I'm going to get a little more up close with this picture here. We're going to discuss different examples of biotic factors in an ecosystem. And as I go over the biotic factors in the ecosystems, you're going to write the words that I give you in the biotic section in your notes. Then as we go over the abiotic factors, you will be writing those things down in the abiotic factor section. So let's look at biotic factors first. Again, the stem bio means life, so these are all living things in an ecosystem. Our first example is protists, so go ahead and write protists down in the biotic factors box. Protists we've studied before. An amoeba is an example of a protist. They are living things that you can find in certain ecosystems. Animals. All animals are living things, so they all are considered biotic factors in an ecosystem. People, of course, plants, and even bacteria. So not only things that you can see with the naked eye, but even microbes considered, like bacteria, are considered biotic factors. Symbiosis is not actually a living thing itself, but it's a way that living things actually interact with each other. So go ahead and also write the word symbiosis in your biotic factors box. Symbiosis is, there's different examples of it that we will learn about later in this unit, but we have talked about parasitism. Parasites are organisms that live on or in a host and cause harm to the host. So it's the way that two different living organisms are interacting with each other. That's just an example of symbiosis. Predation is another example of how living organisms are interacting with each other. So predation refers to predator versus prey relationships. So a wolf and a bunny, for example, the wolf would be the predator and the bunny would be the prey. That's an example of how two living things are interacting with each other in an ecosystem. So we can also consider that a biotic factor. Our abiotic factors are the opposite. A means without and bio means life, so without life. Rocks, as I mentioned in the last slide, were non-living things that are essential in an ecosystem. Living things often rely on rocks. Bugs, for example, live underneath rocks for their shelter. Weather is not necessarily a thing, but it is a way in which non-living events affect living things. So if I have a lot of rain or not a lot of rain, or something is really windy or it's very hot, all of these things affect the way that living things are able to exist in an ecosystem. If I had a drought, which is a long period of time without rain, that would affect the living things. That would affect the plants that grow in that environment. If the plants are unable to grow, that affects the rest of the food chain, because then organisms that rely on those living plants for food are not going to have their source of food. And then things that rely on those next things are not going to have a source of food. So it kind of creates a domino effect in the food chain. The air is an essential abiotic factor in every environment. So we have to have air to breathe. I know that you can't see the word, it's behind my head here, but the word is temperature. So go ahead and write temperature in your abiotic factor box. The temperature in a certain ecosystem is going to affect the types of living organisms that can live there. So in a very hot, dry environment like the desert, you find certain plants can live, like cacti, but other ones can't. Or same thing if it's a very cold environment, only certain organisms can survive in those types of environments or those types of temperatures. Natural disasters are also an example of abiotic factors because, again, these events can affect the living things in the ecosystem. If a volcano were to erupt, that could disrupt the habitat that a lot of living organisms live in. It could kill a lot of plants, which kills a lot of the food sources for other organisms in the food chain or food web. If there's a tornado and it tears down the homes of people, that has displaced part of the ecosystem. People can be a part of the ecosystem. Soil or dirt. If we don't have good soil, you can't grow certain types of plants, and therefore you can't have certain types of organisms that eat plants. And then the sun, of course. The sun is an essential part of most ecosystems. Almost all living things rely on the sun for life. So all of these examples are examples of abiotic factors that the biotic factors, the living things, depend on in order to have a productive ecosystem. So what are some different examples of ecosystems? You've talked about different ecosystems in the past, I know that. If you take a look at this map, it's all color-coded and you have a key over here. In the key, these are all examples of different types of ecosystems. So as you can see, depending on where you're located in the globe and what type of climate that area has, depends on what type of ecosystem can exist. So near the north and the south poles, we have a lot of white. Those are icy ecosystems. Only certain living things can live in areas like that. There's not a whole lot of living things that can. If you get into this area, it's still really cold. It's called the tundra. You have more living organisms in the tundra, but still not as many. If we go to the complete opposite and go more towards the equator where it's really, really hot and warm, we have totally different types of ecosystems. This is where you have tropical rainforests and you have deserts and you have grasslands. And all of those ecosystems support different types of life. For example, in the tropical rainforest, you have all sorts of really cool different types of organisms, lots of tree frogs and cool canopies and all sorts of plant life, versus if you're in the ice or in the tundra area, you're going to have very little living things, very minimal amounts of plants. And when you have minimal amounts of plants, you have minimal amounts of organisms that eat plants. So again, all of these down here are examples of different types of ecosystems. Even the water, the ocean versus fresh water, where you have the Great Lakes or different freshwater bodies of water like rivers and lakes and stuff. Different organisms live in the ocean versus the organisms that live in freshwater like lakes and streams. What makes an ecosystem stable? So you have to have three basic things in order for an ecosystem to survive. The population numbers of each organism. So we have to kind of keep a balance in the living organisms. So you have to have enough plant life. You have to have generally many, many more plants or producers than you do top predators. And I know you've talked about some of that stuff in the past in food chains and food webs. For an ecosystem to be stable, you need a lot of producers, a lot of plants, and then you need less organisms that eat those plants, like rabbits, for instance, and then you need even less things that eat the rabbits, all the way up to top predators. If those things get out of balance, the ecosystem falls apart. It's kind of a domino effect. If you have a lot of predators at the top, but not very many prey at the bottom, the predators are going to go hungry because they don't have a lot of things to eat. If there's not a lot of plant life in the area, then you're not going to have a lot of organisms that eat plants, and then so on down the food chain. So you have to have a good, predictable amount of each organism that exists in an ecosystem. You have to have a good supply of resources. So resources would be things like food, water, sunlight, shelter, so a place to live or hide, like rabbits and chipmunks. They always need to run and hide under things to stay away from the predators so they can survive. So if you don't have enough food for all the organisms in an ecosystem, the ecosystem is not stable. Then you have to also have a good flow of energy. That comes back again to the food chains and food webs, where you have more producers and less top predators. The flow of energy, again, comes back to what we've talked about with food before. Why do people or other organisms eat food? We eat food in order to get energy. Same thing goes in the animal kingdom when you start talking about food webs. The reason a wolf eats a rabbit is to get energy. And so the energy is transferred from the rabbit to the wolf or whatever's eating it. That's the whole basis of the ecosystem. All right, so then we're going to look at the hierarchy of the biosphere. So the biosphere is all the ecosystems in the world, going from the ocean floor all the way up into things that live in the air above us in the atmosphere. And so there's different kind of sections of that biosphere that we're going to break down. And a lot of these things are also part of your vocabulary words. So first, at the smallest level, we have an individual organism. So that would be, for example, one person or one rabbit or one bird or one tree, just an individual organism. Then from there, we get a population. So a population is a group of organisms which are the same species. So if I have a forest full of trees, or I have a herd of elephants, or I have a group of rabbits, I'm not sure what a group of rabbits is called, but they're the same organism and there's a group of them. That's considered a population. Then we have a community. A community involves more than one population of organisms. So it's a group of trees that I have in the forest, and then I also have rabbits that live in the forest, and I also have bugs that live in the forest, and I also have wolves that live in the forest. So all of these different populations of different species that live together creates a community. And then in our community, then we go one step higher into an ecosystem. So an ecosystem involves all of the living things we mentioned. So the trees and the rabbits and the birds all living together in the forest, but it also takes into account those abiotic factors, those non-living things that are necessary for the ecosystem. So we still have to have the sun and the air and the water and rocks and soil. All of those things go together in an ecosystem. And then lastly, all of that gets lumped together in the biosphere. The biosphere is all of the ecosystems on Earth, from the sub-sea floor in the deep ocean up to the atmosphere. So the biosphere includes all of these things. The biosphere has many different ecosystems, as we mentioned, and then that ecosystem can be broken down into just the different groups of living things in it. And then if I took the living things in the ecosystem and broke it down to each individual species, just the group of rabbits or just the trees, and then you can break that down even further into each individual organism. Biodiversity. We've talked about the word diversity before when we talked about genetic diversity. We know diversity means differences and bio means life. So this is literally the variety of life that's in a habitat or ecosystem. We know that we have lots and lots of different living things in an ecosystem, and that word that we use to describe it is biodiversity. So what kinds of organisms might you find in a freshwater pond habitat? So we'll take a look at this picture for a minute. We obviously notice right off the bat the trees. We notice the grass and the weeds along the edges. You probably can imagine that there's turtles or fish in the pond. But when we take a little bit of a closer look, you notice a lot of things that you may not have been thinking. So again, we've got different birds that visit this ecosystem, this pond habitat. We have the different types of cattails and different kinds of reed plants, water plants. We have little mice that come to the pond to drink. we have turtles, and then we have all of this little tiny stuff that nobody ever thinks of that lives in the bottom of the pond, that are essential to that whole entire ecosystem. So we've got algae, we've got different types of worms and snails, we've got protists and fungi and other types of microbes and bacteria, and we even have detritus, which is the waste matter. So when something dies in a pond and it floats down to the bottom and creates all that muddy crud at the bottom of the pond, that's also an essential part of the ecosystem. That dead detritus, the once living things, is actually considered a biotic factor. Even though it's dead now, it was once living, which makes it a biotic factor. Okay, and then there's one more little section we want to talk about, something called carrying capacity. Now, I mentioned before that we have to have a balance of living organisms and supply of resources and all of that for an ecosystem to be productive. So carrying capacity has something to do with that. So go ahead and jot down this definition of carrying capacity. It's the number of living things that a habitat can support based on the natural resources available. So natural resources being food, supply of water, shelter, and a place to live. And if we take a look at this graph here, it kind of shows us what carrying capacity is in one example. So this is the number of reindeer in an ecosystem versus the year. And so at first, in 1911, it says the 25 reindeer were introduced to an island. So they put a new species on an island where they weren't normally before. So you start out with just a couple of reindeer. Now over time, those reindeer reproduce and we make more and more reindeer. And then around 1935, the population really goes up. So when you put a new species into an environment where it's not naturally found, normally there's not any natural predators, which means that there's nothing to keep those number of organisms in check or in balance, as I mentioned. So we see in about 1935, the population of reindeer skyrockets to more than 2,000 different individual organisms, okay, individual reindeer. But then it has a really drops down really fast. The reason is this ecosystem has reached its carrying capacity. It can only support this many. And if you read here, it said that we had so many reindeer in this island that they ate up all the grass. It's the same type of organism which eats the same kind of food. When you have a ton of organisms that all eat the same kind of food, we get competition. And that food, the grass that they were eating, at one point is gone. There's no more plants. And if there's no more plants, there's no more food for the reindeer, which means the reindeer start to die because they're starving to death. So the carrying capacity is the amount of organisms that a certain ecosystem or habitat can support where everybody's healthy, has enough food, enough shelter, enough water in order to live happily. All right, guys, I think that's it. Make sure you got all those notes. Thanks for watching.